developer who was in trouble. He was the lead for Project Phoenix, and morale on this team was very low. Someone had just left the team, and the lead developer who started with the team had left quite a while ago. And despite a recent reduction in scope, his team was rushing to get everything finalized with the finish line literally in sight. Am I echoing? Stay here? Okay. This is my zone this is my bubble. All right, I will stay in the bubble. So this team was close to the finish line, but morale was low. They had people leaving the team, and Parker needed to do something. He knew that he was in great danger of his release not making it to production. Now, John P. Parker wasn't a developer in the sense that we are developers, nor was he a lead developer in the sense that we're lead developers. He wasn't building an application delivered over the internet with a team of Java programmers or people working in Erlang or JavaScript. He was a lead developer on something called the Underground Railroad. Now, the Underground Railroad existed during the 18th and 19th century, and it was a system, a resistance system, designed to end or help end slavery in the United States. And I know that this is a hard period of history. This is a period of history that it's often difficult to talk about. But I really believe that there are so many great leadership lessons that we all can learn from John P. Parker and the Underground Railroad. Now, hard history is something that it can be difficult to grasp. It can be even painful for us to think about. But part of living is understanding the dark side of life. Part of working in the present is having a great understanding of the past. And I think that despite the unpleasantness of history, history will repeat unless we all build a collective memory and a collective resolve to make sure that certain things never happen again. Because honestly, there are people who will misuse history in order to take us back to times that most of us really should never want to go back to. Now, by hearing hard history, there are benefits that you'll get. By being able to confront the hard history of this country, of the United States, you'll gain valuable insights. One, you'll build an intuition, because history does repeat. Where Mark Twain said, history doesn't repeat, but it does rhyme. And by understanding some of the lessons of history, you'll be able to see when these patterns are happening again. So that's one major benefit of hard history. The second main benefit of confronting hard history is that you'll be able to flex your stamina and grow your stamina and your ability to handle unpleasant things. You'll be able to resist the procrastination that so often sets in when you have to do something that you really don't want to have to do. I'm sure that many of us work with code bases that have areas that we don't want to go into. Maybe there are lines of code that we really should just toss, or maybe there are these huge methods that should be refactored. But by understanding hard history, by hardening ourselves with the ability to deal with hard history, we'll be able to do what's right. Now, to understand John P. Parker, this conductor on the Underground Railroad, we have to understand what the Underground Railroad is. Well, first, it was neither underground nor was it a railroad. It was underground in the sense that it was secret. And this was a secrecy that was required to build a resistance movement against a system that had protections at several levels of government. The enslavement of people was protected by the U.S. Constitution. If you go to Article 4, Section 2, you'll find the clause that gives protections for people who own people legally in this country. But it was a railroad because this movement decided to borrow terminology from the ride-sharing service of its time, the railroad, which was high-tech. We see trains go by, we might ride on trains, but in the 1850s, trains were the Ubers of their times. So these enslaved people, formerly enslaved people, people who had their freedom, who wanted to help end slavery, they borrowed terminology from the high technology of its time in order to mask, but also effectively communicate what they were doing. But you know, this really shouldn't be that odd, because software, we've always borrowed terminology from other areas to help better understand what we're doing. Those of you who have worked in the agile set of practices called Scrum, well, Scrum is a term from the sport of rugby. And those of you who have also worked in Scrum probably work in sprints. And sprints clearly come from track and field. So in technology, we always have borrowed from other places in order to help better understand what we're building. And you know, I'm not sure which one of these runners develop in Vue or React or Angular, but there are front-end developers everywhere who work in terms that are from their profession. And so the Underground Railroad borrowed terminology to describe their network. They borrowed it from the locomotive railway system. So the Underground Railroad was a system. It was a system of people and pathways that provided a way for enslaved people to get to freedom. And the secret network stretched all the way from Boston to Austin, where we are here today. In fact, there are probably Underground Railroad safe houses not far from where we're standing right now. And so this was a network of self-organizing teams who were operating in conditions of extreme uncertainty. Right? Does that sound very familiar? Right? We're self-organizing teams, often operating in conditions of extreme uncertainty. And their remit, their purpose, was to ship the most valuable product of all, freedom. Now, the 1850 census, which was taken at the height of the Underground Railroad, listed this number. There were 3.2 million enslaved people in the United States. 3.2 million people. And their so-called owners had the legal protection to own them. And they had absolute control over their lives. Slavery was hereditary, meaning that if you were a slave, all your children were automatically slaves. And it was for life, meaning that for most people, you lived a slave, you died a slave. And it was the mission of the Underground Railroad to help these people find an escape route to freedom. And actually, the Underground Railroad was structured in a way remarkably close to how we build software today. And you're saying, no way, that can't be possible. It is. So, for an operation that relied mostly on uneducated people, in fact, it was illegal to teach enslaved people how to read. It was illegal to teach enslaved people to give them an education or to teach them math or science. But these were the people who ran the railroad, and it was amazingly complex. You had these different roles. First, you had stations, and stations were safe places, often in people's homes, but it could be a barn or even a cave. These stations were places that you went between while you went on the railroad. And station masters, and if you look on the right side, those people waving are probably the station masters. Those are the people who owned the station, and they made sure that any recent news, because while you were traveling through the network, you couldn't communicate, was relayed to the travelers on the Underground Railroad. So they were information brokers. They were also people who would coordinate with other station masters and with other conductors to make sure that the Underground Railroad ran well. And then we have stockholders. And now stockholders, that's probably the person in the yellow shirt. That person's job was to make sure that the stations were stocked with food and clothing. Many enslaved people, as they escaped north, they were going to experience their very first winter in the north. And so their field clothes weren't appropriate to go through that experience. So they often had shoes, because a lot of these people didn't have shoes and coats and gloves and all these things that they really needed to survive going north. Stockholders were the people who were the financiers of the Underground Railroad. They provided money so the operation could run. And then, of course, we had the conductors, which were the lead developers. Those are the people who guided people through the network. And then we also had travelers. And those were the people who were really shipping themselves through the network, shipping the product of their personhood to the north. And so you say, okay, that makes sense, but how does that work in practice? How can you map these roles on the Underground Railroad to a software development team today? Well, let's give it a try. So this is a totally random picture from the internet. I don't know who these people are, I promise you. But they're a software team. And you can probably guess who the Underground Railroad members are, right? The guy with the khakis, yeah, he's obviously a stockholder, right? You can tell because he's wearing khakis, he has the cool haircut. That's the VC, he might be the guy who runs the budget. That's the stockholder. And of course, the people in the middle, they have those kind of lazily cut hair. Yeah, those are probably some of the station masters. They're responsible for making sure that there's Red Bull in the fridge and that the fridge is stocked. So those are the station masters. And then, of course, the person on the far right, clearly a lead developer, clearly responsible for making sure that the people kneeling at the bottom, the travelers, get the work done. So there you go, a total map to the Underground Railroad with the software team. And you could probably make these analogies in your own teams, in your own companies. So that's how I map the Underground Railroad to the software practices that many of us use today. So many of you may say, no, I'm still not convinced. Well, let's try this. So this is a very common way to ship software today. So you have the onshore and the offshore split, right? So you have the client team on the left. They come up with ideas and products that they want built. Those go to an onshore team that has a lead developer with a team of developers, and then they go sometimes offshore, often offshore, maybe to India, maybe to some Russian state in order to do the development, and then they get software shipped to the end user. So if I rotate this a little bit and then overlay the Underground Railroad, there you go, right? You have the onshore team, which are people in the south, that have lead developers or conductors on their Underground Railroad that take teams that go offshore often in order to get the product to the hands of those people. Often in Canada, a lot of slaves escaped to England, so thank you for my UK brothers and sisters. My ancestors, thank you. So they went to other countries, so there's this mapping there. I could tell you so many stories about the ingenuity and the courage that people who operated on the Underground Railroad exhibited. You had this person here, his name was Henry Botts Brown. Henry was born in Virginia, and he literally put himself into a box and mailed himself from Virginia to Philadelphia. And he was in the box for 27 hours, and the box flipped several times, but he emerged a free man. I could also tell you about this couple. This is William and Ellen Craft. William and Ellen Craft were both enslaved people who got married while they were still in slavery. And Ellen was biracial, and she was fair-skinned enough to be able to pass for a white person. So they came up with a plan. Ellen would dress up as a white man and pretend that her husband was her servant. And then they boarded several railroads and several ships, and they sailed and they railroaded their way to freedom. Now, I think this is a great example of marital therapy. My wife is here. We might sign up for this. This is a great exercise, right? But I think that John P. Parker is a great person because I found extremely helpful leadership lessons that I derived for how he helped Project Phoenix get from trouble to success. And I think that we can all learn about those lessons and apply them to our teams. But we got to learn a little bit about John P. Parker first. So John P. Parker was born into slavery, and at the age of 8, he was sold. And he was shackled to another older man who was also an enslaved person, and he walked about 100 miles from Norfolk, Virginia, to Mobile, Alabama. Now, I don't know what you were doing when you were 8 years old, but you probably weren't walking 100 miles chained to someone else. And so John P. Parker developed an early hatred of the system of slavery. And when he was sold in Alabama, he was very fortunate to get sold to a doctor who had sons. And even though it was illegal to teach enslaved people to read, these sons would sneak him books, and he learned how to read. And so John P. Parker actually tried to escape several times. He was unfortunate, not successful many of those times, and came close to losing his life. But he eventually was able to hire himself out to one of the doctor's friends. There was this woman who he would serve, and then he would be able to complete a payment plan and buy his freedom. John P. Parker also learned a trade. He learned the trade of metalworking, of creating these molds that will be used to create things like hinges on doors and other household and commercial items. And so Parker eventually moved to Ripley, Ohio, and Ripley is a very key place to know as you go throughout the rest of the story. And John P. Parker actually founded his own iron foundry, so he became a business owner. And Parker eventually became one of the wealthiest men in Ohio. So Parker found a career in Ripley, but he also found a calling. There was a very strong anti-slavery movement in Ripley during this time, and there were white people and black people united in trying to do what they could to end this system. And almost by accident, he became an agent. He became a conductor on the Underground Railroad. Now, Parker changed from a wealthy industrialist who lived a double life. He would run his successful business during the day, and then almost every night, he would take his ship across the Ohio River into the slave territory of Kentucky in order to help free enslaved people. Now, this wealthy person by day, vigilante by night, it's kind of a weird concept. I know we have a hard time understanding it. Or, someone who works in iron, who is wealthy, but he decides to fight for justice. I know that's kind of hard for us to understand how that could be, but that's who John P. Parker was. And I really think that his early childhood trauma is what drove him to fight against slavery. And Parker started rescuing 2 people, then dozens of people, and eventually he helped hundreds of people find freedom from going from the slave territory of Kentucky into the free state of Ohio. But Project Phoenix was one of his hardest missions, and it took all of his creativity, all of his ingenuity, all of his grit in order to be successful. So Parker's involvement in the Phoenix Project began probably how a lot of you got involved in software, right? It was by accident. He heard about these slaves who were deep in Kentucky, and they were freeing slavery, this group of 10 people, to go north. And so they started the project, and they made it about 20 miles from the Ohio River. So they were close, but their leader got captured. And not surprisingly, their velocity went down to 0. They stopped moving, and the Scrum masters in the room were saying, "Ugh, I hate when that happens." So this team stopped moving, and they were deep in the dangerous territory called the borderland. So what's the borderland? The borderland, if you can see the state of Kentucky in the lower left-hand corner, and then you can see Ohio. The Ohio River goes between those 2 states. And south of the Ohio River in the state territory of Kentucky was called the borderland. It was thick, it was wooded. There were often patrols because barely one night, and almost every night through the borderland, one slave would try to break through to get to freedom in Ohio. And so the borderland was the place you had to cross in order to get to freedom. And it would have been impossible to escape through the borderland for any enslaved person without the Underground Railroad. And, the risk was very real. It was an area that was constantly patrolled, often with hounds, with dogs barking, trying to sniff out the scent of the escaping people. And when word leaked that there were in-state people making their way through the borderland. Other people would join in because you would often get a bounty. In fact, Parker would eventually have a bounty of $1,000 on his head, dead or alive. And that was a large sum of money during this time. And so the plight of the Phoenix team spread throughout the region, spread throughout the Underground Railroad. It got to Ripley, where they found Parker. And Parker, as you do, volunteered to leave his freedom in Ohio and go down into Kentucky to help the Phoenix Project. And Parker also, as you do, put 2 pistols in his belt and a knife in his pocket, because this is the 19th century. These are rough times. And I'm not saying that you should bring guns to your projects in order to keep your team. I mean, we're in Texas, but even here, we don't bring guns to build software. So think of these guns as incentives. Think of them as incentives. And that brings us to our first leadership lesson, and that is prepare your incentives before you need them. Parker prepared his incentives before going to the team, and you would do well as a lead developer to make sure that your incentives are prepared in advance. And I have a few incentives. I don't like financial-based incentives because they're often gamed, and people usually, you get unintended consequences. So I like time-based incentives, like, hey, we're going to give everyone a week, after either we finish a big milestone or maybe it's every few sprints, work on any project you want. And most developers really love this incentive. Or maybe you can provide not cash, but funding for training, coming to conferences like lead developer, or maybe even buying books. Not necessarily cash, but access to education for their own self-improvement. So those are the incentives that I like. Now, the key thing is to gather your incentives in advance. And really, ideally, you'll have a portfolio of incentives that will allow people to pick. And so maybe most of your team members would love to go out, drinks on the company after work, but that member of your team who has kids and has to pay for childcare, they may want to just go home early and maybe get an Amazon gift card to buy something nice for their kids. But you can't offer that flexibility if you don't prepare your incentives in advance. So Parker and the former slave went back across the river. He got with the Phoenix team, and this team was well fed because they were the last station house gave them a lot of food, and so they weren't hungry, but they were just in shambles. They were emotionally drained because of what was going on. And so, in fact, many of them said, let's just quit. Let's just give ourselves up to the people who are chasing us. Well, Parker decided that decisive action was needed. He had to get this team moving. So he gave their order to get your stuff together and let's go. And immediately one of the members of the Phoenix team began to just yell and protest. And so Parker reached for his incentives and he pulled his gun and he said, look, you can either move or be shot on the spot. Now again, we don't do that in our teams. So let's translate into the elegant weapons we have for the more civilized age in which we live. So when you join a new team as a lead developer, this is the second lesson, bold actions set the tone. There were times like when I've been a Scrum Master to join a team and I come to the first stand-up and everyone's sitting around a conference table and the meeting lasts for an hour. Like that's their stand-up? And so day 2, and I've done this multiple times, I get to the meeting room early and I push all the chairs out of the room. And I stand in this room and the first person arrives and they kind of look at me strangely, but then they stand next to me, the next person arrives and we're standing up, and I can get that 1 hour seated meeting to 7 minutes, right? Because the whole idea of a stand-up is to shorten the feedback loop. Let's figure out what's going on, get a plan for the day, then get back to the sprint backlog. And so that bold action was key for me to be successful. And so my bold action, set the tone, and I explained some of the theory behind the stand-up and what it means. And so that helped me help the team experience the true benefits of agile software development. Now, Parker didn't have time to explain his theory to the team. And he knew that they couldn't go through the roads because those roads were constantly patrolled by slave hunters. In fact, there were probably people looking for the Phoenix Project right now. but there was one problem. So the borderland was a very wooded area. And so Parker was a very experienced woods person, so he could go through the woods just fine. But this team, they were snapping on branches and rushing through the brush, and it was a very loud expedition, which is not a good look when you're trying to move without being noticed. And so Parker realized that the noise of their movement would probably reveal their location. And so, some of you have been there, right? Your team stumbling through the woods, there's lots of noise. It sounds like a team surrounded by JavaScript, right? And so they're trying to make their way, but they're drowning in the 19th century version of JavaScript, which leads us to our next leadership lesson. Don't let your experience bias you. Don't let your experience bias you. Many of you are lead developers because you were developers. You have a lot of experience. And often your experience gives you a bias toward what you're good at. Maybe you're really good at React, but on this project, Angular would be better. Or maybe you have a lot of experience with Amazon Web Services, but this is a project that could really benefit from Google Cloud Platform. So you have to be able to do what's best for the team, because your job is not to leverage your experience, but to create an environment where the entire team can be successful. And so that's what Parker did. So he found that when he led the team through the ravines where there was nice soft moss and there was just nice dirt, that they moved quieter. So he basically converted his team to TypeScript. And so he was able to allow his team to have an easier way, and the morale went up. They began to flourish and believe that they could actually make it to freedom. But there was soon another problem. One of the single men in the group, right? So this is a group of 10 people, 2 couples, right? Husband and wives that were in Project Phoenix, but one of the single guys gets really thirsty. And he says, I need to go get something to drink. What is it with single men anyway? I've been married for 16 years. In fact, my wife, like I said, is here. You want to stand up real quick, babe? There she is. Married men live longer than single men. I'm just saying. So this thirsty member of the Phoenix Project, when they get something to drink, then they hear a loud shout, right? So Parker has his team lay down. And then they see the single man who went off out of their view come running back. Now, thankfully, he had forgotten where the team was, because they soon saw 2 slave hunters running after him. And then a few minutes go by, and they hear the sound of a gunshot. And Parker looks over, and he sees his team getting distressed. And so he knows that one of them may cry out or try to run after this person, which would give them all up, right? They would all find themselves back in slavery. So Parker pulled another incentive out, and he said, he just quietly said, if you move, I'll shoot you. And so that, again, quieted his team. Which leads us to our next leadership lesson, which is embrace continuous solving. A lot of lead developers, when they first start leading teams, think that you solve a problem and you'll never see it again. That's not true. You're going to have to often solve the same problem over and over and over again. Teams are like code bases. They're always changing. The technology may change, the leadership may change, the competitors could change, and like code, a change can break something that you once thought was working, right? That's why we regression test. And so you have to always realize that some of the problems that you thought were solved may reoccur. In fact, I found that after I fixed the stand-up at different companies, that I would have to fix the sprint planning meetings and then the sprint retrospectives, and I had to always solve these problems, because the problem was not Scrum, the problem was a horrible meeting culture. And so I have to embrace continually working to solve that problem. Because the sad fact is that problems don't die, only people do. So be kind to your problem and work with them to soften your problems. By the way, if you ever go in a job interview and they ask you, describe a problem that you once solved, don't say, well, problems don't die, people do. That's just keeping it real at the lead developer Austin, as we do. That's just private. Out there, use your best judgment. So, and so Parker has to understand that, he had to help his team understand their situation, and he had to sometimes solve problems multiple times. So they soon seen the thirsty man being led away with the rope around his neck and his arms tied behind his back. And they soon see him leave. And so that obviously has a negative impact on the team. So Parker realizes that he has to get the team far away from that spot, as far away as possible, because the man who was just captured may tell them, I'm not alone in the borderland. And so they had to get to Ripley. And so to get to Ripley, they had to cross the Ohio River. And so they went through the woods of the borderland, eventually came to the Ohio River, right? And so we're back where we started this story, right? One team member had just left. Parker had replaced a previous lead developer, but the team is rushing around to get their release to production. So they scattered throughout the riverbank because they had to find a boat. Parker had traveled during the day, which they didn't know. By traveling through the wooded area, he made progress faster than expected, and so he was 24 hours ahead of schedule. Imagine that. It's like you work, through the weekend, and you realize that DevOps had taken down the server. So he's ahead of schedule. So they didn't have a boat from Ripley for him. So they had to find a boat. His team goes throughout the shoreline. They finally find a boat. And then he leaps into the boat because they needed an oar, and they couldn't find any oars. And he finds an oar in the boat, and then he starts to pile his team into the boat because the sound of the pursuers are growing. They ran into a patrol person on the shore who could obviously run very fast. He must have been a C++ developer because he ran so fast. And so he was able to, this patrol person ran and told them about this group, and so they finally began to pile his team into the boat. But then there's another problem. There's one man on the shore because the boat can only carry 9 people, right? And one of the men on the shore who can't fit in the boat is the husband of a wife in the boat. And so Parker realizes that this person is going to have to be left behind. This wife on the boat is going to probably have to lose her husband on the shore because there's no more room on the boat. But the final lesson that I want to share is that you are a lead of leaders. That means that, yep, you have the title of lead developer, but you have a lot of leaders on your team. And sometimes, at times that you can't predict, they're going to step up. They're going to solve problems that you won't be able to solve. And if you create the right leadership environment, you will allow those leaders to develop as leaders and flourish. One of the single men on the boat, so single men aren't that bad, quietly gets off the boat, and he walks over, and he stands on the shore, and the husband gets in the boat next to his wife. And they row across the Ohio River to freedom. That's leadership. Leadership inspires more leadership from the people you lead, and good lead developers are able to do that. So Parker gets the team back to Ripley. They move on through the network. Parker never sees them again. Now, Parker was one of the most fascinating conductors on the Underground Railroad, but they all have certain traits that I want to go through very, very quickly. One core trait of the Underground Railroad, of working in it, was to not feel fear of failure. When you're a lead developer, there are a lot of ways that you can be afraid. You may be afraid of making a mistake. You may be afraid of people in your team not liking you. But you can't let that fear paralyze you. Making mistakes is part of building software. We have to be willing to be wrong 1,000 times to get it right once. And often leadership is like that. So don't fear mistakes, learn from them. Another core trait of the Underground Railroad and the people who ran it was courage. And that is that you can fight an oppressive system. The Underground Railroad was fighting a federal government that wanted to destroy it. And so we, as software developers, we all have to fight big companies that want to break our culture. And a lot of the people in the Underground Railroad, freeing enslaved people wasn't part of their job description, but they did it anyway, right? They were farmers, bankers, they had jobs like Parker did, but they believed that freeing these enslaved people was worth it. And many of you don't have, for example, ending the toxic culture that's often in our industry in your job description. But you should help do that because it's right. A culture where apparently you can come to work and find someone hiding under your desk. We can all fight that oppressive system to make our industry better. Also, you have to have the trait of empathy to be on the Underground Railroad. Empathy takes the question, if I help these enslaved people, what will happen to me? And reverses it to be, if I don't help, what will happen to them? And we have to ask ourselves, if I don't help the people, if I help the people who are marginalized in tech, what happens to me? We have to change it to, if I don't help them, what will happen to them? And so we can all use our leadership to make our industry better. I'm a solution owner at a company called Slalom, and I sit in boardrooms every day, multi-billion-dollar companies, multi-million-dollar software projects, and my job is to make things go right. And every time I'm in that boardroom, a little bit of the Underground Railroad is in that room with me. It informs how I lead, the respect I give to my coworkers, and the values that guide my every decision. And I hope that as you explore your history, you may not have gone to an Ivy League school like MIT or Stanford, or you may not work in Silicon Valley for a big company like Facebook or Google, but I hope that you explore your own history and take from your history and your life lessons that help make you a better leader. Because I think that there are great lessons from history that will make us all better lead developers. And I think the Underground Railroad is a great place to start. Thank you.